I get tons of requests and recommendations for new stories from you guys, and I truly appreciate each and every one of them. I log each request into a running spreadsheet for future research. Some requests are able to give me a good starting point to go off of. Others, not so much. But I do like a good challenge, and I find myself coming back to these requests often to start my research over and over again, just to see what I can find, if anything. Most of those types of requests are fragments of stories, those viewers remembering hearing something from their childhood. But only some parts are remembered. Those requests often don't lead me to anything substantial, but I do love the work, especially the idea of finding a long-lost story, putting it back together, and bringing it back out into the light of day, even if it is just for one particular viewer. Such is the case with today's story. It all started with a comment on a previous video from viewer Hunt Life. Hey, speaking of, my dad told me a story about a snake handler preacher. This was in Calhoun County, and a rattler obtained that he was warned about. Wish you could find out about that tale. No name, no time frame, no state even. But you did give me an occupation and a county name, and as luck would have it, that was enough to get me started. So, here you go, Hunt Life. Let's look into the story of George Went Hensley, Pentecostal minister, passed away in 1955 in Calhoun County, Florida. Cause of death officially recorded as suicide by way of rattlesnake bite. Everyone loves a good, strange, weird, or bizarre story. Well, welcome to the American South, where dark legends and haunted history lurk around every corner. Where superstition, folklore, and a touch of backwoods magic blend with everyday culture. Some say, in order to survive. This is Dixie After Dark. George Went Hensley was born May 2nd, 1881 in Scott County, Virginia, to Emmanuel Madison Hensley and Susan Jane Bradshaw Hensley, one of 13 children. Although birth records report him as being born in Virginia, descendants of Hensley all report him telling his children he was born in West Virginia, but that his family had roots in Pennsylvania. This could be a ruse or simply confusion because, as we'll soon find out, Hensley's entire life, it seems, was always spent on the move. The first 10 years of his life, census records and other documentation record Hensley and his family living in both Hawkins County and Loudoun County, Tennessee, before his family made their way back to Virginia. It's reported that Hensley's mother and sisters were all very religious women, and Hensley himself was raised Baptist. It was at a revival service in a coal mining camp sometime in the late 1890s near Big Stone Gap, Virginia, that Hensley encountered an elderly woman handling a snake during a service, an image that would forever be burned into Hensley's memory. By his early 20s, though, Hensley had left the Baptist church. In 1901, Hensley married Amanda Winninger, and the couple moved to Winninger's brother's 400-acre farm in Ottawa, Tennessee, and set up a house in a small shack on the property. To make ends meet, Hensley worked in local mines and helped his brother-in-law's lumber mill, as well as making moonshine on the side. It was in Ottawa that Hensley attended a Holiness Pentecostal Church of God service, being led by the teenage son of an evangelist. During the service, Hensley said he experienced a life-changing conversion. He made immediate changes to his life, quitting tobacco and alcohol, as well as ending friendships with anyone that he now deemed worldly. Originally, Hensley was said to be content with living off the high of his recent experience at the Church of God service. But over time, Hensley began to question himself. He never questioned the experience, but he started to question whether he was living the correct way or a righteous life that Scripture called for. It was during this time that one particular passage kept calling out to him, one that brought back the memory of a coal mine revival from his childhood. "And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils. They shall speak with new tongues. They shall take up serpents. And if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover." Hensley said that this passage caused him to doubt his very salvation, so he went to a nearby hill to pray for God's will. While climbing the hill, Hensley encountered a timber rattlesnake. He immediately knelt down in prayer in front of the snake, then snatched it up and brought the snake back to his church, telling the rest of the congregation to prove their salvation by holding the snake. Somewhere between 1908 and 1914, Hensley had begun holding regular snake handling services in various parts of rural Tennessee. According to testimonies from his followers, a revival broke out in the early days of Hensley's ministry, and slow but steady, word spread, and his follower count grew and grew. All of this was despite the fact that Hensley could not read. What Bible passages he did use was from memory, but Hensley did claim to receive messages by divine intervention while speaking. Originally, the Church of God denomination didn't have any issues with Hensley's snake handling. In 1914, Hensley even held a snake handling service for the organization's bishop in Cleveland, Tennessee, and applied to be an official minister within the Church of God a year later. With help from his wife on the official paperwork, Hensley was granted a minister license within the Church of God in 1915. Hensley began leading services throughout Tennessee, and word of his ministry even appeared in the Church of God's newsletter, many of the articles written by his wife Amanda herself. Hensley even held joint services in 1922 in Ohio with his sister Bertha, who was also an ordained minister within the Church of God. By that time, snake handling had become a common feature in the denomination of the Church of God. That same year saw the peak of popularity in snake handling within the Church of God, but that year also saw Hensley's resignation from the ministry. Hensley claimed his resignation was due to, quote, troubles at home. It wasn't much later that Hensley and his wife Amanda separated, Amanda claiming their issues were due to Hensley's temper and drunkenness. They had 8 children together. A short time after that, Hensley was arrested for moonshine-related charges in 1923. He was sentenced to 4 months in jail and fined $100. Hensley was initially assigned to a chain gang working on road construction, but was moved to lighter work jobs when the guards found him likable. During one of these assignments, he was sent to a nearby well for some water. Hensley took the opportunity to escape, fleeing to one of his sister's farms back in Ottawa, before eventually making his way to his sister Bertha's home in Ohio. While in Ohio, Hensley returned to his ministry, this time with a focus on faith healing with the help of Bertha, who would read passages from the Bible, followed by a sermon on those passages by Hensley. He did this for several years, and eventually a divorce was granted to his wife Amanda in 1926. That same year, while delivering a service at a Salvation Army in Ohio, Hensley met Irene Klunzinger, and the two married about a year later in 1927. The couple moved a few times but stayed in Ohio, the two eventually having 2 children together. In 1932, someone that had witnessed Hensley's former church services back in Chattanooga, Tennessee, recruited him to come to Pineville, Kentucky. There, Hensley built the Pineville Church of God, labeling it as a, quote, free Pentecostal church. Even though Hensley had now built a church of his own directly from scratch, he still took his family on the road and kept traveling. Records have him and his family in Pennington Gap, Virginia, for the birth of their 3rd child 3 years later in 1935. And a month later, property records have them living in St. Charles, Virginia. Here, records show that by this time, Hensley was back into conducting snake handling services to larger and larger crowds. One event in Norton, Virginia, has records showing nearly 500 attendees, but chaos soon erupted when a boy at the service was bitten by a snake, the first officially recorded injury at one of Hensley's services. In 1936, Hensley built a house on the back of a truck and took to the road, ending up performing revival services in Florida. By March of that year, Hensley is found holding a revival in Tampa for around 100 people, then in Bartow to a reported crowd of 700. A month later, in April, Hensley was in Barrow County, Georgia. It was at a service in Barrow County that a farmer got sick from a snake bite. Reporters confronted Hensley about the incident, but Hensley only claimed that the farmer was, quote, not quite ready for the demonstration of the power, end quote. Hensley assured the reporters that the young man would recover due to a miracle, but the farmer died instead, giving us the first recorded death of a George Hensley church service. Hensley went on to officiate the man's funeral himself, but then immediately left the area over fears of the police looking to prosecute him after the local newspaper condemned his services and actions. Hensley went back to his safe haven in Ohio briefly, then moved back to his church in Pineville, Kentucky. By then, the culture within the Church of God had begun to shift though, and it was in his first established church building that Hensley was arrested for snake handling. After a brief stint in jail, Hensley moved to Knoxville, Tennessee. Hensley was in Tennessee until late 1941, before he and his wife Irene had a falling out due to Hensley wanting to place their children in an orphanage so that he and Irene could take to the road again. The couple had separated various times in the past, but this would be the final straw, and a divorce was granted to them in 1943. After that, Hensley spent some time in Indiana before returning to Pineville, Kentucky, then ultimately back to Ottawa, Tennessee. Even though snake handling had started falling out of popularity, Hensley stuck with it, and in 1943 he teamed up with a dedicated follower of his, Raymond Hayes. They started a church together called the Dolly Pond Church of God with Signs following. This lasted for about 2 years until a member of the congregation died from snakebite. Hensley said that the man's death was ordained by God to test the faith of the other members, as well as to demonstrate the outsiders of how dangerous snake handling really was. Hensley was arrested by authorities out of Chattanooga, Tennessee for snake handling and given a $50 fine, which he refused to pay, even when threatened with another jail sentence. He was ultimately released, though, and never paid the fine when church members protested the judgment. Hensley then took back to the road, but by this time, rumors of his past were starting to catch up with him. Even though some were willing to forgive him and welcome him in their towns, his family had started to distance themselves from him. In 1946, Hensley met and married Inez Hutchinson, a widow with 10 children, but this marriage lasted less than a year. After that separation, Hensley is found preaching back in Chattanooga, Tennessee, marrying again in 1951 to Sally Norman, who was happy to take to traveling with Hensley. By the mid-1950s, the couple had moved to Athens, Georgia. In July of 1955, Hensley is found hosting a series of revival meetings in Altha, Florida. By this time, Hensley had stopped incorporating snake handling into his services, worried about the legal issues the actions now brought on. But now he had decades of rumors and stories behind him, a reputation preceding him, I guess. It was at one of these meetings, on July 24th, 1955, that a member of the congregation presented Hensley with a 5-foot rattlesnake. Hensley delivered a sermon on faith to a group of a few dozen people, then removed the rattlesnake from its container. He wrapped it around his neck and paraded it around the abandoned blacksmith shop they were meeting in, using the snake as a demonstration of how strong his faith in God was. It was when returning the snake back to its container, though, that it appears that the rattlesnake had had enough of the show. It struck out, biting Hensley on the wrist. It only took a few minutes for Hensley to become visibly ill, as well as showing signs of severe pain, along with discoloration to his arm. Those in attendance urged him to get to a doctor, and some even notified the Calhoun County Sheriff's Department, who also tried to get him to go to the hospital. But Hensley refused. One of the people in attendance told reporters that Hensley blamed the bite on the people's lack of faith. Hensley's wife Sally seemed unbothered by it all. She simply stated it was God's will. George Went Hensley died early the next morning on July 25th, 1955. Calhoun County Judge Hannah Gaskin ruled his death a suicide, since Hensley voluntarily handled the rattlesnake, then refused any treatment after the bite. He was buried 2 days later in nearby Mount Olive Cemetery. After the funeral, a group of people that had attended the services announced their intentions of continuing the practice of snake handling, viewing the legal issues behind the practice as, quote, religious persecution. Hensley's wife Sally committed herself to continuing the teachings of Hensley, saying she had not lost, quote, an ounce of faith. Today, the practice still persists in remote rural areas, despite states having laws against it. Well, except West Virginia. Georgia cracked down on the practice of snake handling the hardest for a time, making it a felony punishable by death in 1941, although that law was repealed in 1968. Aside from West Virginia, who has no laws against it at all, Kentucky seemed to be the most lenient, making the practice a misdemeanor, punishable by a $100 fine. Most of these churches practice in private, but there are known ones in Alabama, Georgia, Indiana, Kentucky, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia. Kentucky and Tennessee having the most. Exact cases are hard to come by, since, if they practice largely in secret, it would be safe to say that deaths would not be 100% reported accurately. But most officials agree that there have been more than 100 fatalities as a result of these types of services. There have been no documented deaths from a non-handling member being bitten by a snake being handled by someone else, if that makes you feel any better. The movement today still sees George Went Hensley as a great man, many seeing the accounts of his various moonshine charges and others as lies. The movement still sees him as one of the most influential people in the advancement of their beliefs, and Hensley is generally given credit for spreading the practice of snake handling across the southeastern United States. I will say, this is not something I've come across personally here in the South, and it definitely isn't something I'd want to, or even go looking for. A test of my salvation and faith? I don't need snakes crawling across my face for that. Life itself is a big enough test for me, and daily life is a test I fail at continuously. But hey, you do you. Maybe you have it right all along, and by the grace of God, we can meet up one day in heaven, and you can tell me all about it. Just leave your snakes down here.